Hello, and welcome to Dispatches from the Civil War, a podcast breaking down events of the American Civil War week by week in real time. My name is Logan, and I will be your guide on this journey. In this episode, I will lay out some events that are the foundation for the beginnings of the Civil War. The first slaves are brought to what would become the United States in 1619. Even though these 20 are indentured servants, it will not be long before what would become known as chattel slavery is established. Most would be in the southern colonies, but there would be a few thousand in the north. Between 1780 and 1804, the northern states eventually will abolish slavery, whereas in the south, slavery becomes intimately intertwined with the economy and way of life. In 1787, delegates meet to draw up a federal constitution for the newly formed United States. I'm pouring one out for the Articles of Confederation. One of the key areas that creates friction is what to do about slavery. Several southern states refuse to join in the Union if slavery is not allowed. George Mason, a delegate from Virginia, states that slaves, quote, bring the judgment of heaven on a country, unquote. 3 clauses in the Constitution sanction the continuation of slavery. 1, fugitive slaves are to be returned to their owners. 2, slave trade is to be permitted until 1808. And 3, for the purpose of appropriating congressional representatives on the basis of population, a slave is to be counted as 3/5 of a white person. In the ensuing debate, most states, North and South, are against placing so much power in a national government and denying powers to the states. The combined issue of slavery and states' rights will percolate for the next several decades. In July 1787, the outgoing government under the Articles of Confederation, the Congress passes the Territorial or Northwest Ordinance. A clause states, there shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in said territory. This will affect an area that will eventually be Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. A technological development that will have a great impact on slavery happens in October of 1793. Eli Whitney applies for a patent for a cotton gin. This device will soon increase the need for more labor to produce more cotton, and since most of the cotton is grown in the southern states, this will lead to the need for more slaves. In 1799, the New York legislature will pass an Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery, which is based off of a similar law that Pennsylvania passed in 1780. This states that slavery would end on July 4, 1827. Slaves born before 1799 would be freed unconditionally on that date, and those born after 1799 were obligated to remain indentured until they were 28, or if they were 25, if they were female. In August of 1800, one of the most ambitious slave revolts up to that point happens in Richmond, Virginia. Gabriel Prosser, a black slave coachman, plans a revolt to liberate thousands of slaves in the area. Authorities have been following the events thanks to an informer, and he and his followers are arrested. The size of this revolt will convince Southerners that stricter measures should be used to maintain the institution of slavery. On January 1, 1808, the importation of slaves from abroad into the United States is legally ended, as called for by the Constitution. However, the buying and selling of slaves within the United States continues, and in practice, many new slaves continue to be smuggled into the states. The enabling legislation itself provides that those smuggled slaves, when apprehended, are to be turned over to the state authorities and that the states may then sell the slaves. In 1820, Maine is admitted to the United States. Since Maine is a free state, this would upset the balance that is focused on by all parties. To work around this, a bill is adopted by the Senate that combines the admission of Maine with the admission of Missouri as a slave state. Along with this, there is a compromise that would bar slavery in the rest of the Louisiana Purchase north of the 36-degree, 30-minute latitude line. I always feel special saying those degrees like that. This will become known as the Missouri Compromise. I can only imagine how many politicians slapped themselves on the back thinking they had saved the day. Stay tuned. In May of 1824, Congress passes another protective tariff law, but it still leaves the South feeling discriminated against, even while Northern manufacturers are unsatisfied with it, so shout out to them for upsetting everyone. By 1827, this law will have prompted such protest as an anti-tariff meeting in Columbia, South Carolina, where Thomas Cooper, president of South Carolina College, will ask, "Is it worthwhile to continue this union of states? where the North demands to be our masters and we are required to be their tributaries? The groundwork of secession could be percolating at this point in the South. Undeterred, Congress will pass another tariff law in 1828, which will call for high duties on a variety of goods, but affecting raw materials more than manufactured goods. This, of course, will impact the South more so than the North. Promoters of the bill are motivated at least in part by a desire to embarrass President John Quincy Adams, but he ends up signing it. This could be a lesson here at not passing legislation with the purpose of trying to politically embarrass someone. Very soon it becomes known to Southerners as the Tariff of Abominations. Someone should claim that as a band name. And this leads to widespread protests and demands by some that the Southern states separate from the Union. Could it be that a nation so young is going to render itself apart before the first centennial? Business is going to pick up in late 1828 when the South Carolina legislature responds by adopting a series of resolutions condemning the Tariff Act of 1828 and questioning its constitutionality. Appended to the formal resolutions is an unsigned essay, South Carolina Exposition and Protest. Someone should also claim that one as a band name. This argues that any federal laws considered unconstitutional may be nullified by a state convention. This exposition of 1828 is significant since the author is John C. Calhoun, previously a very strong nationalist, now the Vice President of the United States. The Georgia legislature also adopts resolutions against the Tariff Act of 1828. In January of 1830, while debating the issue of the sale of the vast lands of the American West, it becomes very clear that the real issue is that of states' rights versus federal power. This sets Southern senators against Northern senators, and in his ringing in to his defense of the latter, Daniel Webster concludes, "Liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable." In January of the next year, William Lloyd Garrison will begin publishing The Liberator. This newspaper is dedicated to the abolition of slavery. Nat Turner will lead an uprising of slaves in Southampton County, Virginia, in August of 1831. At least 60 are killed before soldiers put down the rebellion. Turner and 12 of his followers are executed along with another 100 during the search for the rebels. As with other slave revolts, this will inspire a crackdown and stricter measures taken with slaves. Disgruntlement will once again visit the South with another tariff act in July of 1832, even though this one is more moderate than the 1828 version. This will be followed up in November when South Carolina has a special state convention to nullify the tariff acts of both 1828 and 1832. Things are about to get interesting as the legislature adopts measures to enforce this ordinance, calling for military preparations and succession if the federal government resorts to force. President Jackson will answer this with a proclamation warning the people of South Carolina that no state can secede from the Union because each secession destroys the unity of a nation. Jackson will put actions to these words by reinforcing the federal forts off of Charleston, South Carolina. In response to this, South Carolina legislature raises a volunteer unit to repel any invasion that King Jackson might send. Jackson will go to Congress and ask for a force bill to enable him to enforce the provisions of the Tariff Act of 1828 and 1832. But Henry Clay, always up for a compromise, draws up a new tariff bill that includes a gradual cutback in tariffs. When word of its probable acceptance is passed to the South Carolina, the legislature cools down a bit and suspends its nullification ordinance. Congress adopts both the tariff compromise and the force bill, I guess in an attempt to hedge their bets, and President Jackson signs them within 24 hours. Impressive considering the lack of printers. The confrontation has been averted, and at the end of March 1833, everyone's kind of cool. Unfortunately, things will be heating back up in October of 1835. A mob will parade William Lloyd Garrison through the streets of Boston with a rope around his neck to express their disgust with his extreme views on slavery. Very subtle. For a change of pace from tariffs, in December of 1835, Santa Anna, President of Mexico, proclaims a unified constitution for all territories of Mexico. The settlers in Texas announce that they intend to secede from Mexico rather than give up their right to slavery, which Mexico had abolished. In early 1836, the siege of the Alamo will inspire settlers to meet in a convention, declare their independence, and draft a constitution. In April, General Sam Houston will lead the Texans to defeat the Mexicans and capture Santa Anna at the Battle of San Jacinto. The Constitution is ratified, Houston elected president, and an envoy is sent to Washington to demand annexation to the United States or recognition of the independent Republic of Texas. This brings back the debate of pro-slavery Southerners against anti-slavery Northerners, since Texas intends to legalize slavery. The following month, Southern members of the House of Representatives get enough votes to pass a gag resolution. This will declare that all petitions or papers that in any way involve the issue of slavery should be laid on the table. That is, there should be no discussion. The House will continue to vote for such a gag rule at the beginning of every session until 1844, but instead of burying the issue of slavery, it only sharpens the differences between the two sides. Just proves you can't just ignore something long enough to make it go away. President Jackson has avoided making a decision on the status of the Lone Star Republic of Texas. This is due to not wanting to aggravate an agitated North and South. Jackson will make a call on this towards the end of his administration in March of 1837. Currently, the tally of slave and free states is at an even 13. However, there are large territories that are about to be converted into states, only one of which, Florida, is a slave state, while the other three are non-slave. A movement to admit Texas as a slave territory to balance out these free territories is defeated. In August of 1839, the Spanish slave ship, Amistad, will have a mutiny led by one of the slaves, Sinique. They will kill the captain and the crew except for a handful that are forced to navigate the ship to North America. A United States warship will bring the Amistad into a Connecticut port. Spain immediately demands that the slaves be turned back to them, but Americans force the case into the courts. This will eventually go to the Supreme Court, during which John Quincy Adams argues for the right to be freed. In March 1841, 2 years later, the court will rule this way, and Sinique and the others are returned to Africa. Despite suggestions otherwise, William Henry Harrison gives a lengthy inauguration speech in poor weather conditions and proceeds to die 1 month later in April of 1841. Wear a coat and a hat. When Vice President John Tyler succeeds to the presidency, he calls for a day of national prayer. During this day, various speakers around the country use the opportunity to speak out on the issue of slavery. One minister in the South is reported as taking the occasion to preach on, quote, current wild notions of equality. I feel confident that that sermon will age like buttermilk in the hot summer sun. In January of 1842, the U.S. Supreme Court will rule in the Prigg versus Commonwealth of Pennsylvania case that a Pennsylvania law forbidding the seizure of fugitive slaves in that state is unconstitutional. However, they will go on to say that the enforcement of fugitive slave laws is entirely a federal responsibility. This loophole will allow northern states to adopt personal liberty laws. After a treaty agreeing to the annexation of Texas to the United States is signed and submitted to the Senate in April of 1844, the Senate will reject it during June. Anti-slavery forces have convinced a majority that admitting a slave state will simply lead to another confrontation between the South and the North. I wonder if anyone turned and looked at Henry Clay and he just said, I don't have that dog in me anymore. He's just a broken man. In early 1845, Congress passes a joint resolution that allows for the annexation of Texas. This sidesteps the required two-thirds vote of the Senate that is typically required for ratifying a treaty. Mexico severs diplomatic relations with the United States as soon as this resolution is adopted. In July, Texas will agree to annexation, and President Polk decides to treat it as a state even though it remains Mexican territory under international law. Polk sends a detachment of United States Army, led by General Zachary Taylor, to the southwestern border of Texas to guard the state against any perceived invasion from Mexico. President Polk will order General Taylor to take his troops onto the left bank of the Rio Grande, which has been recognized as Mexican territory. Polk is clearly trying to pick a fight with Mexico. This will happen in April when a small Mexican cavalry unit inflicts a few casualties on the United States troops blockading a Mexican town. In May, as requested by President Polk, Congress approves a declaration stating, By the act of the Republic of Mexico, a state of war exists between that government and the United States. In the debate leading up to this, it is clear that this is another divisive issue between the North and the South. Southerners mostly support the war as they see it leading to more territory to be worked by slaves, while the North mostly opposes the war for the same reason. I can only imagine that after seeing what happened with Texas, Californians decide they want some of that action as well. They want to break away from the rule of Mexico, so they proclaim the existence of the Republic of California. Along with this, there is a bit of a dispute brewing between the United States and Britain over the border between the Oregon Territory and Canada. Polk, anxious to gain support for the widening war with Mexico, submits to the Senate a treaty that extends the international boundary along the latitude 49 degrees to Puget Sound and then to the ocean through the Juan de Fuca Strait. In return for Southern support, Polk agrees to reduce certain tariffs. The Senate ratifies this treaty. Anticipating to purchase territory from Mexico that will follow any fighting, Polk asked Congress for $2 million. The Wilmot Proviso will be added to this, named after Pennsylvania Representative David Proviso. The Wilmot Proviso uses words taken verbatim from the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall ever exist in any part of the territories that might be acquired from Mexico. Once again, Northerners and Southerners are divided over similar issues. To make things interesting, the House will pass the appropriation bill without the proviso, and the Senate will pass the bill with it. John Calhoun will introduce 4 resolutions that attempt to provide justification for the Southern position. Calhoun will argue that Congress has no right to limit existent or prospective states in matters of laws pertaining to slavery. Furthermore, since slaves are like any property that might be taken into a territory, Calhoun argues that Congress has the obligation to protect slavery. Calhoun's doctrine effectively sets aside the Missouri Compromise of 1820, and although the Senate in no way endorses it, the doctrine is in the air. And that's where we'll stop things for this week. Next week, we will pick up Prologue Part 2 in December of 1847 and see what events transpire. I'll see you next week.